Berlin, August 1st, 1914. Late afternoon, the light already going gray through tall windows nobody's thought to close. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the most powerful man in Europe, by title if nothing else, turns to his top general with a question that should have a simple answer. Can we mobilize against Russia only? Can we leave France out of this? General Helmut von Moltke doesn't answer right away. There's a silence in that room that outlasts what a silence like that is supposed to last. Then he says the thing no one expected to hear. "It cannot be done, Your Majesty." Not, "It would be difficult." Not, "Let me see what I can arrange." It cannot be done. The plan, years in the making, a machine of trains and timetables and supply lines synchronized down to the hour, has exactly one setting. All of it, or none of it. There is no lever in Berlin, in Vienna, in St. Petersburg that can slow this down now. The most powerful men in the world are about to discover they built something none of them can stop. How does an emperor lose control of his own army? How does a war nobody in this room actually wants become the one thing none of them can prevent? And if the men holding all the power couldn't pull the brake, who could have? To understand that, you have to go back 5 weeks. Not to a battlefield, to a room. Several rooms, actually. And in every one of them, the same quiet human failure, repeating itself with different faces until it was too late for any of them to matter. Here's the part that should unsettle you before we even start. This isn't really a story about armies. It's a story about what happens inside any group of people, a cabinet, a company, a family around a dinner table, when everyone privately disagrees and nobody wants to be the one who says it first. You've been in that room. Maybe you're in one right now. The machine that trapped an emperor in 1914 is the same machine that keeps a bad decision alive in a meeting long after everyone in it has quietly stopped believing in it. Europe, in the summer of 1914, believed it had solved war. Two great alliances stood facing each other. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy on one side, France, Russia, and Britain loosely bound on the other. Each one a deterrent to the other. Nobody attacks, the theory went, because everyone knows exactly who avenges whom. And the theory kept holding. A close call in 1908, when Austria annexed Bosnia and nearly dragged Russia into it, resolved. A crisis in Morocco, resolved. Peace again and again, right up to the edge and back. So what lesson does an entire generation of statesmen learn from a decade of near misses that never actually break? Exactly the wrong one. It always works out. That lesson was about to become the most dangerous idea in Europe. The man at the center of the coming storm wasn't supposed to be a casualty at all. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was, of everyone in Vienna, one of the few voices arguing against a war with Serbia. He wanted more autonomy for the empire's restless Slavic provinces, not a war that would inflame them. He said so, often, to anyone in Vienna who'd listen, a man whose own goal was quietly at war with the ambitions of the men around him. The morning it ended, Sarajevo was hot, the streets thick with crowds who'd turned out mostly out of curiosity. An assassin's bomb had already missed him once, thrown at his open car, bounced off, and detonated behind it, wounding bystanders instead. By any reasonable measure, the day's danger should have been over. Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing anyway. First to the town hall, then to visit the wounded in hospital, a detour nobody had planned for. His driver, given the change in route, took a wrong turn onto a side street, realized the mistake, stopped the car to reverse. It stalled directly in front of a delicatessen, directly in front of 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip, who had given up on the plot minutes earlier and happened to be standing there by accident himself. 2 shots, fired from a few feet away. His wife Sophie was hit first, reaching across to shield him. He didn't understand at first that she'd been struck at all. He was asking her to stay alive, for their children's sake, when he lost consciousness himself. In the space of a few minutes, nobody in that convoy saw coming. Irony sitting there in plain sight. The war party in Vienna didn't lose their most inconvenient obstacle to some rival's careful plot. They lost him to a wrong turn and a stalled engine. What happened next is where this story really lives. Foreign Minister Count Berchtold wanted Serbia crushed, a reckoning Vienna had wanted for years and now had a justification for. But Austria-Hungary needed to know Germany would stand behind it first. On July 5th, an Austrian envoy arrived in Berlin to ask. The Kaiser's answer, delivered within 2 days, no conditions attached, is remembered today as the blank check. Whatever Vienna decided to do, Germany would back it. It's worth understanding why Wilhelm's answer came so fast and so unconditionally. He'd spent his entire reign in the shadow of a birth injury that left one arm withered and weak, hidden in official portraits, compensated for with an almost theatrical need to look strong in every other way that mattered. His own grandmother was Queen Victoria. His own cousins sat on the thrones of Russia and soon would sit across from him as enemies in Britain. Historians who've studied his personal letters describe a man perpetually terrified of being seen as the weak link among relatives who doubted he belonged at the same table. A blank check, signed fast and without conditions, wasn't just policy. It was a man proving to an audience of family who'd always half-doubted him that he could act like an emperor. Here's where you'd expect the first crack of dissent. You'd be right, just not from where you'd expect it. On July 7th, the Austro-Hungarian Crown Council gathered in a room heavy with cigar smoke and the particular tension of men who already know what answer they've been sent there to reach. And one man said no. Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza argued on the record that an unprovoked war on Serbia would look exactly like what it was, and that it would drag in Russia, and behind Russia, everyone else. For one meeting, his objection held. The room did not reach agreement. A week later, it did. Nothing about the facts had changed, not one new piece of intelligence, not one shift on the ground. What changed was the room around him. The private tension of watching every other minister at that table align behind war, one by one, until staying the last voice of caution stopped feeling like principle and started feeling like isolation. Tisza signed his name. Watch that moment closely, because it's about to happen twice more to 2 different men in 2 different countries within the same 3 weeks. The ultimatum Austria-Hungary sent Serbia on July 23rd was never designed to be accepted. One clause in particular, demanding Austrian officials be allowed to conduct their own investigation on Serbian soil, was written knowing no sovereign nation could agree to it without surrendering its own independence. Which makes what happened next stranger still. Serbia's answer, delivered right up against the 48-hour deadline, accepted nearly everything. Rejected only that one clause. Offered international arbitration for the rest. Even Kaiser Wilhelm II, reading it, is said to have remarked that it removed every real reason for war. 3 days later,
Austria-Hungary declared war anyway and began shelling Belgrade. The first artillery of a war that would run for 4 more years, from a city most Austrians couldn't have located on a map 3 weeks earlier. Here's a detail that complicates the story further.
When news of Franz Ferdinand's assassination first reached the streets of Vienna, Berlin, and beyond in late June, the public reaction wasn't outrage. It was closer to indifference. Franz Ferdinand had never been popular. Crowds at his own funeral were thin. The fever that eventually gripped these same cities, flags in windows, cheering columns of young men marching to enlistment offices, the belief that this would be short and glorious, didn't erupt from grief over one dead archduke. It built, slowly, across 5 weeks of diplomatic cables most ordinary people never read, until the war finally arrived and somehow felt, to the crowds waving from the pavement, like a release rather than a catastrophe. Britain's Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, spent those final days proposing something almost embarrassingly obvious. A conference. 4 powers, 1 table, before anyone mobilized another soldier. Germany didn't reject the idea outright. It simply never pushed Vienna to say yes. Grey's proposal wasn't defeated by an argument. It was outlasted. The same quiet fate that had already caught up with Tissa's objection a week earlier. Now the machine that was supposed to prevent all of this took the decision out of every human hand still holding it. Slow down here. Because this is the moment everything could still have turned out differently. Russia, bound by old promises to defend Serbia, began partial mobilization on July 29th. That night, in a palace study lit by a single lamp, Tsar Nicholas II did something almost nobody remembers about this story. He changed his mind. In a remarkable, almost tender exchange of telegrams with his own cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm II, each man addressing the other by childhood nicknames, Willie and Nicky, Nicholas wired words that survive in the historical record to this day. I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure brought upon me and be forced to take extreme measures which will lead to war. He was, in his own hand, begging his cousin to help him avoid the exact thing his own government was already setting in motion. And for a few hours, one single night in St. Petersburg, the room held. Peace was still, technically, sitting right there on the table. You'd be forgiven for thinking, right here, that this is where the story turns, and the war doesn't happen. Then his generals got to him, told him a partial mobilization was a fantasy. The railways, the supply lines, none of it was built for half measures, and hesitating now would leave Russia exposed if Germany moved first. Under that pressure, in the space of a single night, Nicholas reversed himself again. General mobilization, authorized, July 30th. That same day, in Berlin, a report crossed the Kaiser's desk suggesting Serbia might still negotiate directly with Vienna. In the margin, in his own handwriting, Wilhelm wrote 3 words historians still quote a century later. Jetzt oder nie. Now or never. A flicker of the same instinct that had briefly moved his cousin in St. Petersburg, and, just as fast, overridden by advisers who couldn't afford for their emperor to look weak after 5 weeks of posturing. 3 rooms, 3 leaders, 3 separate documented moments where a man's own hand wrote down the exact doubt everyone around him needed him not to feel. And in every single one, the doubt lost. Which brings us back to Berlin, August 1st, and a general telling his emperor that the machine those 3 rooms had quietly built together could no longer be stopped by any one of them. Not even by the man who was, on paper, the most powerful of all. Germany declared war on Russia that day because its only war plan required striking France first, through Belgium. Regardless of who Germany was actually fighting, German troops crossed into Luxembourg on August 2nd, demanded passage through Belgium, were refused, and invaded anyway on August 4th.
Britain, honoring a decades-old guarantee nobody in Berlin seriously believed London would actually enforce, entered the war within hours.
Germany's own Chancellor, Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, a man whose private letters that July show real, aching hesitation, whose own aides described him growing visibly grey and silent through the crisis's final days, watched the declarations go out, and said the words historians still quote today: "The iron dice are rolling now. God help us all." There's a name for what happened in those rooms. Psychologists call it groupthink, a term coined decades later by psychologist Irving Janis, studying an entirely different set of disasters: the Bay of Pigs, the failure to see Pearl Harbor coming, the slow walk into Vietnam. Small, tightly bound groups, facing enormous stakes under enormous pressure, quietly stop checking their own thinking against reality, because checking feels, in that room, in that moment, more dangerous than being wrong. Look again at what you just watched, and you'll see every piece of it. An illusion that everyone agreed, built entirely out of people too uncomfortable to break the silence. Doubts written down in private and buried in public. Advisors, Nicholas's generals, Wilhelm's inner circle, filtering out exactly the hesitation their leaders needed to hear at exactly the moment it mattered most. And underneath all of it, a shared, unspoken certainty that whatever came next couldn't really be that bad. Soldiers on every side that August were told they'd be home before the leaves turned. Historians still argue about how much of 1914 was structural, an alliance system so rigid that collapse was only a matter of time, and how much was individual men making individual, reversible choices under pressure that for a few hours here and there they nearly reversed. This account leans hard toward the second explanation, because the paper trail these particular men left behind, 3 separate handwritten moments of doubt, makes it difficult to call anything about this inevitable. Reasonable historians still weigh it differently. There's one more piece of this worth naming, because it's the piece that explains why nobody outside these rooms could have intervened even if they'd wanted to. Janis called it mind guarding, the quiet, often well-meaning habit of the people closest to a decision-maker, screening out exactly the information that might make him hesitate. It wasn't a conspiracy. Nicholas's generals weren't lying to him about Russia's rail capacity. Wilhelm's advisors weren't inventing the risk of looking weak. Each one, in the moment, genuinely believed they were protecting their leader from a mistake, the mistake of backing down. That's what makes mind guarding so much harder to see coming than sabotage. It looks, from the inside, exactly like loyalty. And it's exactly why the men who spoke up even once, Tisa briefly, Nicholas for one night, Wilhelm in a margin note, never had a chance against it. None of these men were fools. Several were, by any fair measure, brilliant. Groupthink doesn't need stupidity. It needs a room, a clock, and a cost of disagreement that feels heavier right now than a catastrophe that hasn't happened yet. 17 million people died before that particular kind of silence finally ran its course, and roughly 20 million more came home wounded, if they came home at all. A toll nobody in those rooms had budgeted for, because nobody in those rooms had planned past the short and glorious version they'd each privately promised themselves. The strain of the war Nicholas II mobilized for eventually broke the very throne he was defending. 3 years later, he and his family would be gone, swept aside by the revolution the war had bled his empire dry enough to allow. Tisa didn't outlast the war either. In October 1918, soldiers broke into his home in Budapest and shot him, in part for the war he'd once tried, for one meeting, to stop. The Ottoman Empire didn't survive the peace either. Its collapse redrew the map of the Middle East along lines 2 European diplomats sketched with little regard for the people living inside them, lines still shaping conflicts a century later. And the peace that finally ended it all was punishing enough on the losing side to leave the door open for an even larger war 2 decades on. You don't need a Kaiser's stationery to find this exact mechanism. It's in the meeting where everyone quietly thinks the launch date is a mistake, and nobody says so, because the date's already been announced. It's in the family gathered around a decision nobody actually wants, going along with it because saying otherwise, out loud, right now, feels like the harder thing to survive. It's in every silence that gets mistaken for agreement.